one of the great legal minds that I've had the pleasure of getting to know just over the last few months, and I have really appreciated his insights. His last visit, he told us a lot about this idea of due process for illegal aliens. And I want to explore it even further with Josh Hammer, host of The Josh Hammer Show, author of the great bestseller, Israel and Civilization, The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West, which just came out in March. Josh, welcome back, sir.
Chris, you're far too kind, but it's always a pleasure to join you, my friend.
Thank you. I learned a lot from our last visit, and I would like you to impart a little of that wisdom again before we get into one of the more fascinating developments, the lawsuit against John Roberts. Could you just one more time, because we're hearing this a lot now.
Yeah.
Due process, due process, due process. The Constitution says everybody who's here is to be afforded due process. If I heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times. I think all of us need a reset. Counselor, help us with that. How do you define due process?
Well, Chris, this is actually it's wonderful timing for our conversation. In fact, you very graciously plugged my own show, The Josh Hammer Show. My episode out this morning is on this exact topic as well. So if you want more, go check out my own show. But for present purposes, due process as it pertains to aliens, there is a tremendous amount of confusion on this exact topic. So if you actually look at the text of the Fifth Amendment, and the Fifth Amendment pertains to due process for the federal government, the 14th Amendment for states. So we're really focused here on the Fifth Amendment. The Fifth Amendment talks about how no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So if you were looking at this in a vacuum, if you were just looking at this and looking at the words literally, as, for instance, Kristen Welker of Meet the Press did when she was interviewing Donald Trump on Sunday, then you might be inclined to say, oh, no persons here. Well, person doesn't necessarily say citizen, so it could be alien and, a citizen. Everyone seems on its textual surface to be covered by the due process of law clause of the Fifth Amendment. But here is what they're not telling you. What they're not telling you is that the entire notion of national sovereignty, the entire notion of why we establish governments among men, the entire predicate of we the people that are the sovereigns in the preamble of the Constitution, all of that is inherent on the fact that it is the sovereign right of a nation to keep out who it wants to keep out for essentially any reason for any time. And then once you are here and you are not a citizen or you are not on the fast track to citizenship, we can kick you out for essentially any reason at any time whatsoever. For instance, Justice Robert Jackson, one of the great 20th century Supreme Court justices, he was the dissenter in the infamous Japanese internment case during World War II when FDR horrifically rounded up all the Japanese Americans. This was a case called Korematsu. Justice Robert Jackson dissented in the Korematsu case, and because of this, he was known as a great champion of due process. He actually ends up being the lead prosecutor for the Allied powers against the Nazi war criminals in Nuremberg. So a truly sterling, top-tier lawyer, Robert Jackson. I'd say all that for context here because it was that same Justice Robert Jackson who I think explicated the due process clause quite nicely in a 1953 case called Shaughnessy, where he very clearly says that due process does not entail the right of anyone outside of America's borders to come here against our will. And then once you are here as an alien, and here's the key part, legal or illegal, I should say, once you are here as an alien here, you have no due process right to stay here against the national will. So due process at a bare minimum for aliens, here's what I will concede. I will concede that it probably entails what lawyers have long called habeas corpus, which is basically a very fancy Latinate legal term that basically means that you have the right to present a documentation to make sure that we've got the right person. Beyond that, due process is whatever Congress wants it to be. If Congress feels like legislating additional due process protections solely of its own generosity or beneficence, but they are not required to do so. The constitutional threshold is extraordinarily low, and all of this basically gets back to the international law notion of a sovereign nation being able to enforce its sovereignty by having the right to exclude, which is the number one right, that is the right to be a sovereign power.
I'll be listening to the Josh Hammer Show for more on this. Just to be clear, Josh, when you're talking about the Fifth Amendment, it's somewhat left up to interpretation, then, is what you're saying. And people are being fast and loose with it, depending on their point of view politically. Like, if they want all these illegals to just stay in perpetuity, and as Trump likes to say, we'd have 200 years of court cases if that's the way we're going to play this. Right. Is he right? If the left is correct in their interpretation of the Fifth Amendment, then Trump's assertion that we would be having hearings and court cases endlessly for years and years just to deport people is exactly what would happen. And so, which brings me to my question, if we interpret the Fifth Amendment as written by the founders, they clearly were not thinking about the country being invaded by non-citizens when they wrote it.
Yeah, absolutely right. So if you accept the premise that we are currently experiencing an invasion, which is the argument that the Trump administration has made when it comes to its invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, for instance, to deport Nicaragua, they are arguing that we are under a full-scale invasion. Now, reasonable minds can vary as to whether or not this is the case. For what it's worth, my former boss, Judge James C. Ho of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, for what my money is worth, I hope that he is the next Supreme Court justice, an amazing judge. He has actually argued in his own capacity much the same, that what we are currently facing at the southern border does legally amount to an invasion. So certainly, once you concede that, if you accept the premise that what we've experienced at the southern border for the past, call it 5-10 years, at least since January 20th, 2021, and the onset of the Biden administration, if you accept that this constitutes an invasion, then certainly the president's powers to expedite removals really ought to be not even subject to particularly rigorous debate, I would say. But I'll give you one other data point, Chris, which I think is important to this overarching debate here. When we talk about due process, habeas corpus, any of this for aliens in the context of their removal proceedings here, they're not getting their day in an Article III federal court. They're getting their day in an immigration court. But let's think about where those immigration courts actually are based. Well, the immigration courts are actually part of the executive branch. The immigration courts are purely a statutory creation of Congress. Back in around the time of the Immigration and Nationality Act from the 1950s, the Hart-Sellers Act, which is kind of still the foundational immigration statute today, Congress basically created these immigration courts as a way of trying to make things easier. But when it turns out to be the case that Congress's own creation and these executive branch housed immigration courts actually could jam up the works, Congress, if it really wanted to, could really kind of change the way these work and expedite. So ultimately, as is often the case, Chris, the ball, in theory, according to the founders' vision of our system of governance, really does kind of go back to Congress, which was supposed to be the most powerful of the three branches. But Congress, unfortunately, these days does not always necessarily act according to that founders' era vision, shall we say.
Which brings us to the Supreme Court. It's going to depend on them issuing a formal decision on something like this, right? They're going to have to define whether the Fifth Amendment actually extends to illegal aliens that Trump's trying to deport, right? They have to actually define it.
I suppose they do, and I say I suppose because they've really been pretty clear on this for a very long time. I mean, this kind of great left-wing disinformation campaign trying to kind of, read something into the text that the Supreme Court has really never entered text is a fairly recent phenomenon, but it does ultimately fall, for better or worse, on Chief Justice John Roberts and the U.S. Supreme Court to affirm that the Due Process Clause means what it means, and it does not mean what it very clearly means there. And, John Roberts, there's a lot to be said about John Roberts. From my perspective, he's not necessarily doing his job the way that he should be doing right now, because the Supreme Court in general has a lot of authority, Chris, to actually exercise control over the lower courts. The Supreme Court is essentially the boss in the judicial hierarchy there, and especially when it comes to Judge Boasberg in Washington, D.C. He's the guy who's been presiding over this whole Alien Enemies Act dispute when it comes to Nicaragua there. The Supreme Court has a lot of power to really swat down lower court judicial orders that run afoul of our system of governance, and John Roberts and his colleagues don't seem to be particularly inclined to do so there. So, look, on the one hand, there's going to be a lot of high-profile rulings coming here. We're kind of entering the high SCOTUS season, we might say. June is really kind of the #1 month when it comes to SCOTUS opinions there. But definitely when it comes to immigration, I mean, Trump and his administration are heading for a real showdown here with the federal courts, and this showdown is coming whether John Roberts wants it or not.
Yeah, and that's, I don't know, do you have time? Could I hold you over for another segment or no, Josh? Or do you need to run?
I think I might have to run it, unfortunately.
Okay, that's okay. Then let me give you 1 minute to answer a very complicated question. Suing John Roberts to force his hand on all these lower courts, is that going to work?
Chris, it's a bit of a Hail Mary lawsuit, to be honest with you. I mean, America First Legal is filing this lawsuit. I'm a huge fan of Stephen Miller, who founded this organization. I'm a really big fan of his. It's a bit of a Hail Mary, to be totally honest with you, but I really like where the organization's head is at there. They're basically arguing that the Judicial Conference, which essentially makes the rules for the judiciary, that this is not technically part of the judicial branch. It's part of the executive branch, and therefore is subject to the President of the United States and his internal control and administration and so forth there. It's a clever lawsuit. We'll see ultimately what happens there. At this point, Chris, I'm kind of a fan of just throw mud against the wall and see what sticks at this point, so I give them a lot of credit for ingenuity, if nothing else.
Well, so just so I'm clear, I've never heard of suing a Supreme Court justice. Can that be done? And then who ultimately decides that? The rest of the Supreme Court, if it's appealed all that way?
You're asking a fair question, I think would be the polite way to answer that.
Okay, so that would be unprecedented.
Yes.
No, look, it's stunning. I have a stack in front of me today, Josh. Judge rules Trump can't use Alien Enemies Act. Judge orders use of UMass student accused of Tesla firebombing so he can continue sex change. Trump administration asks Supreme Court to end protected status for Venezuelans. Judge strikes down Trump executive order punishing law firm. 20 states attorney generals sue Trump administration to restore health aid. I mean, lawfare is real. The Democrats can't win elections, and so they're using the courts. It's plain as day, and yes, the Supreme Court's going to have to do something about it. Josh, brilliant stuff, as always. I hope you'll come back very soon.
I look forward to it, Chris. Thank you.
The Chris Stigall Show podcast.